O CBO está entre as poucas escolas do Brasil que atendem a todos os critérios. Assim, os alunos...
CBO is amongst the few schools in Brazil that meet all the criteria, so the CBO students can request an osteopath certificate. It really helped in my professional training and even more as a human being. Get to know our syllabus and come to be part of CBO family. The Brazilian Institute of Osteopathic, founded in 1986, has regular classes of osteopathic training in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Rio Grande do Sul, and we are very happy to be a master sponsors of the second World Fascia Congress. Movement leads to tension, and tension asymmetry leads to dysfunction. Know what is the main dysfunction, which tensions to treat, and which tensions to not treat. These are a few of the many topics that the Fascia Quadrant System book brings to you. Hello, colleagues. Greetings from Madrid. My name is Martin Pila, and I'm the academic coordinator of the Tupimac Myofascial Therapy School. And we offer myofascial induction training for many years now, and we will have the opportunity of sharing our clinical practice in the second World Fascia Congress with the Professor Ense Pilat. Do not miss it. We invite you all to be part of it. See you soon.
Hi, I'm Tom Myers, and I'm here to tell you about our 12-session series, the ATSI Structural Integration Program. This program of soft tissue manipulation and movement education is designed to change your postural pattern and through that, your movement, and sometimes reaching into the kinds of things that are dramatized in a postural pattern. If you would like to find a 12-series practitioner near you, you can consult any of our websites, anatomytrains.com, anatomytrains.co.uk, or anatomytrains.com.au. But those are the main three sites where we list our classes and we list our practitioners. So hopefully you can find a practitioner near you, and if not, maybe you'd like to come train in our Anatomy Trains Structural Integration.
Bom dia! Iniciamos agora o segundo...
Good morning, everyone. We are now starting the second World Fascia Congress online. We have a Congress Commission made of Brazilians dedicated to further the study of fascia in Brazil and in the world. So, all the income from this event will be given to the Brazilian Institute with the support of Robert Schleip and Carlos Teco. My name is Michelle, and I will be your mediator during the whole Congress, organized by Lisiane Lumert, Marketing Digital, e Saúde, and Sigma's translations. Support IBO, the Brazilian Osteopathic Institute, CBO, the Osteopathic Brazilian Institute, SOMAF, Anatomy Trains, Hedley.com, Fascia Hub, and Charlie, and a scientific support by Unicinos University. All the event will have simultaneous translation in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. And you just have to click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and choose your language. All the bonus classes will be available for 30 days, the members area at Hotmart website. And we will provide a personalized participation certificate to all the participants. For that, you just need to click at the specific area within the Hotmart website. We now invite Jill Hedley with the fascial details of the abdominal wall explored via dissection. PhD, Jill Hedley has explored dissection in thousands of labs with thousands of students, and he's the producer of the Integral Anatomy series and the author of many books. More recently, he has started the Anatomy from A to Z, more than 200 hours of dissection, exploring beautiful forms, and he's committed to developing the integral anatomy field. Welcome, Jill.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some images with you. I feel very fortunate. Bom dia. How did I do? Carla Oliva brought me breakfast. Pão de queijo. It's delicious. It was warm out of the oven. So I'm going to share my screen with you, but maybe I'll take some breaks for questions and things like that as we go along, okay? Let me find my screen share. So, screen share. There we go. Can they see it? Nod if you can see my rocks. Can you see my rocks? Yeah, it's working? How do we know? Yeah, good. That's what I needed. Thank you. So this is like a memorial because I'm very grateful to the donors and their families. Without the donors, we have nothing to look at. So it means a lot to me to share these images. I speak with the families. I know who they are. So it's very precious. Now I need to go here. I'm gonna make my thing shift. Okay, there we go. So I'll be speaking about some of the fascial details of the abdomen explored through dissection. There's many, many, many dissection images. The images that I show today are very hard won. Each image represents a lot of work. And I'm keen to share with you what I'm learning. And I trust you to view and listen and learn with me. But please refrain from recording or screen sharing or otherwise making off with the content. The conference will provide it for you in a good format. So I'm grateful for their recording of this session. Thank you and enjoy. The body to me is like a holy place. And we study it with interest, but also it's possible, I think, to be elevated, to be transformed, to be lifted up by the opportunity to dive deeply into the human body. So this is maybe a symbol of that. I'm going to start with the dermis, and you may be thinking, why would you start with the dermis? This is a conference about fascia, but the dermis is fascia. I'll show you. So this is donor Anna. I worked with her for 17 straight months. She only just went home a couple of weeks ago. And we reflected her whole skin. And if we look closely, oh, I have to make my mouse big. Give me a moment. Making my mouse big here. This way we can see much better. Accessibility, display. Whoa, no, not that, not the contrast. Display, cursor. There we go. Sorry, give me one moment. Ah, there we go. How about that? So now we can see there's many, many pockets or circles here. This is the patterning of the dermis. If we look at the dermis under the microscope, we can see it's very dense collagenous bands that form loops and pockets. You can see the fatty tissue inside the pocket. But here we're looking very closely at the deep side of the skin, at the dermis. And the dermis forms a web. Sometimes the dermis can be very thick and sometimes more thin. Here, the dermis actually is cut away, but a remnant is left, and it appears like fishnet stockings, maybe. See? It's like a net, like a fascial net that is part of your skin. Maybe you haven't seen it this way. If you type skin on Google, you'll get a graphic cross-section and you will not see this, right? But if you do dissection, you can start to see some of the complex patterning that is the interface of the dermis with the fatty layer beneath it, the adipose. So I refer to the patterning, the morphology of the dermis as dermal patterning. And the dermal patterning can be very condition of the skin, its health, etc. So the dermal layer of the skin is a tensegral, elastic, highly structured textural layer of connective tissue. And therapeutically, I think we do well to understand the different conditions of the dermis. And this is having to do, of course, with the abdomen. I'll show you. There's some leaf patterning. I like to give relief. So this is Anna's belly. This is her abdomen. We're going to study it very carefully today. Anna had a rat bombed. So it was a little bigger even, but still she had a round tummy. And you can see she had stretch marks, very many stretch marks. Stretch marks, stretch marks. I want to show you the anatomy of a stretch mark. If you want to understand fascia of the abdomen, this is an interesting point. Now, there are two ways that the dermis can accommodate the increase of weight. One way is that it flattens, it becomes more flat, and the pattern spreads out. You see how far apart are the dermal circles, right? But here we look at the deep side of the skin of the stretch marks. Look now, we're looking underneath them. Look at the dermal patterning, how it's changed. It's blown out. The circles have exploded. If I look even more closely under the microscope, you see this is a stretch mark. That's a circle in a stretch mark. It's become a line. So there's banding now across the length of the stretch mark. It's not the same anymore. Very hard for this to recover, but at least you understand what it is. Okay. This was Anna's skin held up to the light. The light is penetrating our bodies. The light is penetrating our abdomen even. So now we're going to hypodermis, next layer down. Hypodermis, I call it superficial fascia. I follow the English tradition of Henry Gray. For a long time, they have called the whole panicula or the hypodermis or the subcutaneous adipose superficial fascia. So I use that language. I know sometimes other people use different language. Okay, so here is a gentleman, we call him Art, like an art museum, Art, because he was like an art museum. So this is the superficial fascia of Art, of his abdominal wall and chest. And when we reflect it, we see his belly. So there's great integrity in this tissue. And I'm hoping I can demonstrate that to you a little bit and to demonstrate to you its character as a fascia. It's also kind of pretty, I think. The light is everywhere. So this is a section of the superficial fascia, just a section, and we treated it to make it demonstrate only the collagenous dense matter, and we rubbed away the adipose. And this is the structure of that same piece of tissue. Okay, so the superficial fascia is very, it's irregular in its organization. And yet, even though it's irregular, it is still very organized, dense fascia. With the fat removed, we can have X-ray eyes and see into it. And if we look close up at that same sample, that same specimen, we can see the dense pocked patterning. This is not skin. This is the superficial fascia without with the spongy matter removed of the fat. When we look in cross section at the superficial fascia, we can see membranes that are dense and patterning that create lobular forms, lobules, but the lobules are surrounded by dense fascia that give it tremendous strength. If we look very closely under the microscope at those lobules, can you see so many little tiny dots, right? So a fat lobule is not like a sack of olive oil, right? The fat lobule is very highly structured fascia, all the way down to the most minute aspect. And then the lobules themselves are surrounded by fascia. So if you're touching the abdomen, you have to go through the dermis, very tough, circular fabric that only becomes untough when it's blown out from a stretch mark. It's extremely dense. Then we go to superficial fascia. Again, you haven't touched any muscle of the abdomen yet. You haven't touched the anterior rectus sheath. You have to go through this first also. Something to keep in mind. I'm holding up here maybe 22 kilos. I think 22 kilos, 48 pounds with superficial fascia because of that, the strength of the matrix, okay? Yeah, 22 kilos. Now, perifascia is a word that I made up. I used to call it fuzz, but I don't call it fuzz anymore. Only on YouTube does the old version of me call it fuzz. But nowadays, I describe it as perifascia because fuzz is simply a membrane, a very hyperfluid membrane, transparent, slippery membrane. And when I pull it apart, it looks like fuzz. This is a little movie. I hope you can see it. So I'm pulling back the superficial fascia at the belly wall of this form. And if you look carefully, it looks like we're looking at the anterior rectus sheath, but we're not quite there yet. Look, there's something else. There's something more. Do you see this transparent, slippery membrane moving in front of you? You see it in the light? That's another layer. You cannot understand the abdominal wall if you do not understand that it has a perifascial layer that permits the skin and superficial fascia to move underneath it. And if I grab it, I can show you that we have been forgetting this layer. I'm inviting you to understand it. Look at this beautiful fascial layer. It has tensile strength. It is elastic. See, I let go and it's like a rubber band. It's thin, but extremely important, because if you didn't have that, you would be like a tree. You would be like lumber. You wouldn't have differential movement. So perifascia is the anatomy of the differential movement over and under the anterior rectus sheath. We find it elsewhere in the body too, but because today I'm focusing on the abdomen, I'm making it clear, I hope, that differential movement is a function both of the movement of lobules in the superficial fascia. If you didn't have movement of lobules in the superficial fascia, your stomach would be hard, not in a muscular way, but in a pathological way. And similarly, if you didn't have movement in the perifascial layer, you would have adhesion of superficial fascia to the rectus sheath, to the anterior rectus sheath, and you would have very poor movement. This can happen from scarring, from surgical intrusions, from injuries. So many ways there are to lose movement. And thank goodness for many physiotherapia therapistas who can help people to become more dynamic in their movement after injury. The perifascia and the superficial fascia and their intrinsic movement, you may be able to help at that level too. So perifascia is the anatomy of movement of the superficial sleeve of the abdominal wall. Perifascia enables the skin and superficial fascia to shear relative to the anterior rectus sheath. That's where I live. I can look up the hill to the top of this mountain, and I live down on the plain there. It's a very pretty place. Colorado Springs. So now we have Z. This is donor Z. I worked also with him for 17 months. And we're going to look at perifascia on his rectus sheath, anterior rectus sheath. Z had many fun tattoos, and I'm going soon to a celebration, a memorial service for this man with his family. They're a lovely group of people who were very generous to let me keep their beloved husband and father and grandfather for almost 2 years. So here we're looking now, we saw skin, superficial fascia. Now we see fascia of Z, and we're going to focus here on the abdomen. So we see the crisscross patterning here in the anterior rectus sheath, which is the tendon of the external oblique muscle. But I'm going to show you that even though this is quite clear and clean, pretty much, we can still, with the help of a microscope, see the perifascia. So here is where I put my microscope. You see the circle right on the anterior rectus sheath in around the middle, a little off center. Here's the linea alba. So we're a little off center to the right. We can see here there was a drainage tube from medical intervention. But here we have the imprint, the impression of my microscope. Now, if we look at this, you see the perifascia here. It's very irregular in its organization. The fiber direction has no particular direction, and you can see that the light is reflecting off of the water that is held in this superhydrated tissue, even though what we were looking at there appeared very dry. Right? But when you put the microscope to it, the character and quality of perifascia. But I used a polarizing filter and made a movie of this, and I want to show you that at this point we see perifascia, but underneath it lies the dense regular fibers of the anterior rectus sheath. Here's the movie. Now watch as the image changes from perifascia. And now it's shifting, and you can see in the exact same spot underneath it, the beautiful multiple layers of fiber organization of the anterior rectus sheath. Now, this is just one point on the anterior rectus sheath. If we went somewhere else, we'd see still different fiber organization. I think that's beautiful. And this is how it was before I understood perifascia was there. I would just see these lines, these bands, and think that was it, that there was not more. But in fact, the perifascia penetrates through and between, and that this dense, regular, fibrous fascia of the anterior rectus sheath is actually embedded in the perifascia. So the polarization of the light allows us to drop through the loosely membranous perifascia to see more clearly the dense, regular, fibrous fascia between it. I don't know if this is a movie too. Let's see. Yes. Okay, so we're seeing, again, we're dropping through perifascia. We've just moved the position a little bit, and we see a different pattern underneath it. And then we come back to the perifascia. So maybe in your mind, when you're touching someone's belly, you can imagine that it's not only the dense fascia that you're connecting with, but also the perifascia, which is what is permitting your sense of movement at a subtle fluid level in the tissue. So the anterior rectus sheath is embedded in perifascia. It permits differential movement, both superficially and deep to the anterior rectus sheath. So above it and below it, there's perifascia. With no perifascia, everything is stuck, right? So now we're going to do some dissection of the anterior rectus sheath. Let's see. So that's art, you remember, and I'm just showing this picture because you can see from the shine of the light of the camera that the light is reflecting off of the superhydrated perifascia on top of the rectus sheath. This is also in my backyard. I can walk to this maybe 5 minutes. It's such a pretty place. You have to come here. I know Brazil is beautiful too, but maybe you'll come visit me in Colorado Springs and we'll take a walk together. So the anterior rectus sheath and the external oblique. So here is Z, and here is Anna. Her belly was bigger than Z's. You see, he has concavity here, concavity, and she has convexity. Okay, so the anterior rectus sheath stretches to accommodate the change in the belly wall. The fascia stretches over time. Now we're looking closely at Z's belly wall here, and we can see that cross-hatching. This is extremely typical patterning of the deep fascia of the anterior rectus sheath. This angular patterning here is very predictable. It doesn't much matter whether you're 95 or 25, you'll demonstrate this. It may be different thickness. The fiber quality may be a little different, but the pattern is very predictable. We see the linea alba running down the middle like a central tendon of the belly wall. And we can see that it's impossible, really, with a knife to completely clean the dissection. That's because, as I mentioned, the perifascia is going through this. So you can never make it go away completely. That's only in a drawing. You can draw perfect fascia, but that is only an idea in the mind, not in the body. Okay, we're going to go a little further. And I want to say that the organization of the anterior rectus sheath is changing from here to here. So in this section, it's organized in one way. And in this section, it's organized differently, a little bit. So let's see if we can see that in the tissue. So this upper portion between the costal margin and the umbilicus includes fascia from three different layers. And in the section down here, maybe we have even 7 layers. That's a lot. So it's going to take me a bit to explain that. Wish me luck. So back to the top. So the upper portion of the anterior rectus sheath, you can see, is coming partly from the tendon of the external oblique. Now, if we look carefully, I don't know if this is the best picture for it. Maybe I want to go backwards. So what are those 3 layers? Oh, here's what I was looking for. So do you see this line right here? And do you see this line right here? Normally, when we talk about the arcuate line, we're talking about the posterior rectus sheath. But Z offers a very clear demonstration that the tissue changes right here at the umbilicus. So do you see it becomes more thick? It's more thick in the lower part of the abdomen, and you can actually see that here additional layers have begun to contribute to the formation of the anterior rectus sheath. And we'll see this in detail as we go along. So at this level, it's the tendon of the external oblique. Here I've cleaned the tissue, but there's fascia over it. And I can pull back some perifascia and reveal the fascia over the muscle tissue of the external oblique. Here we see it more closely. We see the external oblique fibers. We see the fascia of the external aspect of the external oblique fibers, and we see some perifascia. So here I've cut it, you can see, and I can lift it up, and this is the fascia on the outside layer of the external oblique. So the external oblique has thickness to it, and it's invested in fascia. The external oblique is invested in fascia on its external presenting surface and on its deep surface. If we combine the external surface and the deep surface together, then we see that the external oblique contributes 2 layers to the anterior rectus sheath. So the top layer I've dissected here, but you can see it coming from the external oblique. And we can also see that what we call the fascia of the anterior rectus sheath is a tendon. It's a tendon of several muscles, but at this layer, we're looking at external oblique. And here, look, it comes down here. There's no more muscle tissue. It's simply formed a long tendon and looping around the spermatic cord. So the fascia of the abdomen is essential to our understanding of pressure differentials in the belly, and also this kind of herniation, which is the spermatic cord passing through the inguinal ring, which is basically a formation in the external oblique fascia, or in the fascia of the lower portion of the rectus abdominis. Now, we can look closely at that, and you see how the tissue is preparing for the spermatic cord to leave, right? It's like water flowing around a rock, right? The fascia flows around the spermatic cord and circles around it, just like it would water and a rock. And it's like a current. The fascia is like a current, a fluid current flowing in different directions. I think that's a beautiful demonstration of that. Also, do you see how it's kind of a little brown and oxidized on the tissue here? That's because if we looked at it from high up, it would seem to be a white fascia. But when we look more closely at the tissue as it oxidizes, we see that it's covered in perifascia, and that's why we have the color change. The perifascia is oxidizing first because it's wet and thin. Excuse me. Now, what about this external oblique in the back? The thing is, we usually think of our abdomen and the abdominal fascia to be something that is anterior. But in fact, the abdomen encircles the body all the way to the spine and the ribs in the back. So if we're going to look at the external oblique of the abdomen in the back, we have to first remove the latissimus dorsi, this large tissue here, and the trapezius. Trapezius is on top of latissimus dorsi. We have to take it away. Latissimus dorsi is on top of the external oblique in the back. We actually have to include latissimus dorsi. You might not have thought that latissimus dorsi had anything to do with your abdomen because it's in a different chapter of your book. It's in a different lesson in your class, and it's in a different part of your brain, right? You're thinking differently about it, but I'm just wanting you to understand that the latissimus dorsi is part of the abdominal wall in the back. But I'm going to remove it. Now I have removed trapezius muscle and latissimus dorsi muscle, and now we see external oblique fibers here, all through here. Here we see the serratus anterior, and then up through the inferior angle of the scapula to the rhomboids, superior and inferior, or minor and major, I should say. So the rhomboids, serratus anterior, and external obliques are all in a continuity, not only of muscle tissue, but also of fascia. So again, our front and our back are not separate things, but continuities, and we divide them with our mind, we divide them with our knife, but we can't divide them in terms of their fascial continuities or the reality of the body. If I look closer at that, we see that I have peeled most of the fascia here so that you can see the muscle tissue, but the serratus anterior and external obliques are interdigitating here, all through here, and that fascial continuity continues here between the external oblique and the serratus posterior inferior as well. Now, as I begin to dissect external oblique and I lift up the edge in the back, this is the ilium to orient you, right? This is the pelvis, and this is fibers of the tendon of serratus posterior inferior. So we see the fascial continuities of external oblique and serratus posterior inferior, as well as serratus anterior. But here I'm lifting up the edge of the external oblique, and what do you see? Fuzz. So in between the layers of the abdominal wall, we have more perifascia. So wherever there's differential movement between abdominal layers, we will find perifascia. Perifascia looks like fuzz when you pull it apart. If I put this back down in anatomical position, it will not be fuzzy. It will be wet, it will be translucent, it will be slippery, and it will be the anatomy of the differential movement between the external oblique and the internal oblique. As I go further, you can see how there remains on the internal oblique a fascia, and also on the deep side of the external oblique a fascia, okay, and in between them perifascia, fuzz. So really it's one system, and I've cut it with my knife and made some here and some here. So we have to understand that although I'm speaking of layers as if they're distinct to the external oblique or the internal oblique, in fact, what we have are muscle tissue and fascia. And we can categorize the fascia in between the muscle tissue any way we like. Okay, so that's up to us and our knives. See, the external oblique is coming away. You can see I'm cutting the serrations away from the serratus anterior here. And it has tremendous integrity, this wall. It's very thin, but the fascia gives it strength. It's always the fascia giving strength to the muscle tissue and not the other way around. This is just a little break for your eyes. The cherries in Colorado are very beautiful. So now we've come to the anterior aspect again, and you see the serrations of the external oblique, and I'm lifting it up from the internal oblique, and it's very clear how the fascial covering of external oblique begins to form the anterior rectus sheath. And I showed you earlier there was a drainage tube. This is a medical intervention that we'll see over and over again on Z's belly wall. Now, I'm anterior again. You can see I'm lifting up the whole external oblique here. And what has happened here? The internal oblique remains covered in its fascia. Where is the rectus abdominis hiding? Rectus abdominis is hiding behind the internal oblique fascia. So there are two layers here, right? The deep side and the superficial side of the external oblique, right? But there's a third layer that we can see here contributing to the anterior rectus sheath, and it's coming from the internal oblique. As I continue the dissection, look, all abdominis of the internal oblique. Now, I mentioned there was a difference between the upper portion and the lower portion. We can also see, and that difference has to do with how many layers of the internal oblique are contributing to the sheath. So in the upper portion, only the outer surface of the internal oblique fascia contributes and goes over or anterior to the rectus abdominis muscle. In addition to these two layers, we have a third layer, and the third layer is from the internal oblique. You can see here there's scar tissue that's formed around this intervention. It was very hard to cut that. So here you can see that the external oblique goes over the rib cage. I had to take it off of the rib cage, right? And so too are the fibers of the rectus abdominis coming over the rib cage, but not so for the internal oblique. The internal oblique comes to the rib cage, but its fascia will extend over the rib cage sometimes, and I'll be able to show that with Anna. So Again, we're very close in now. This is the costal margin. This is the rectus abdominis. This is the anterior rectus sheath being peeled off of the rectus abdominis, but not all of it, only the portion that belongs to the external oblique and its fascia. I've gotten through the hole now, and we're starting to see the length of the rectus abdominis. Now look at this edge. Do you see how it's cut? And now we can see the muscle fiber of the rectus abdominis. Basically, at this point, the rectus sheath has been dissected. Okay, so you can see here we have the external oblique. Here we have 2 layers of the external oblique, and now we have 3 layers. This layer is from the internal oblique layer, deep layer, and these layers are from the external oblique. Here, I was able to differentiate the 2 layers of the external oblique away from the 1 layer of the internal oblique. So 1 layer is here and 2 layers are here. But here we have all 3 layers together have been dissected. I hope you can see that. I hope it's clear, because this is not always easy to see or explain. And I feel that Donor Z gave us a very nice demonstration. Now, when we look down here, we can see that I was able to differentiate the 2 layers of the external oblique away from the internal oblique more fully, right? So it was not easy, but with my knife, I was able to make a difference and show you this, because this was the thicker layer, remember, down here. It's not only the internal oblique, but also the transversus abdominis muscle that is contributing to the inferior portion of the anterior rectus sheath. So do you get it? Just focus on this for now and understand that there are 3 layers comprising anterior rectus sheath. And at this point, the layers are so bound to each other that they cannot be differentiated. Here, I was able to differentiate the layers. And we can see now here, even in the lower portion, there comes a point where all the layers of the anterior rectus sheath are fused. So they've fused together here. I can no longer differentiate them. But this is a very thick tissue here, and that's because it has more contributing to it. So also, we have this relationship of the fascia of the anterior rectus sheath to the rectus abdominis. The relationship is through tendinous inscriptions. So here we see that remnant layer of the external portion of internal oblique. Here we see the combined layers. And here we see zigzags of dense fascia forming the tendinous inscriptions. So we have 2 different fascial relationships here. One is fixed through these inscriptions. And then here we have perifascia. Okay, so we have perifascia covering the rectus abdominis, perifascia. So we have differential movement between the rectus abdominis and the anterior rectus sheath. When the muscle fibers of rectus abdominis contract, they are free to move relative to the anterior rectus sheath because of the perifascia, but they are not free to move. They are fixed at the tendinous inscriptions. This is very different anatomy than on the deep side of the rectus abdominis, but I'll show you that in a little bit. I just want you to note these 2 different types of fascial relationships. One is fixed and one is moving. So now we have a big view of Z's belly with the external oblique is now removed completely. Now, also part of the internal oblique is also removed because it was attached or continuous or fused. And this is normal anatomy, not a mistake. It's normal anatomy for there to be a fusion of layers of fascia in the anterior rectus sheath. And maybe, though we don't have such good luck in dissecting that we get to see the way in which the internal oblique contributes to the anterior rectus sheath. You can see still here it's intact, here it's dissected, here we have external oblique, here external oblique is missing, and so we see the rib cage more fully. So thank you, Z, for showing us the amazing fascia of the external oblique and the way that both of its layers, front and back, contribute to the formation of the anterior sheath. And we have the same dissection of the external oblique. Her muscle tissue was much thicker and her tendon was much more broad. And here we have removed the external oblique of both sides, and we can see again how the internal oblique in its outer layer is contributing to form the anterior sheath. When we hold Anna's external oblique up to the light, we can see very clearly the different thicknesses of the tissues. We see here it's very thin. Rectus sheath that went over the rib cage and covered the uppermost portion of the rectus abdominis muscle. Here is where we see coming in the fascia of the internal oblique, adding to the thickness of the tissue. So here we have 2 layers, easy to see through. Here we have 3 layers, and it's more thick. Now, when we get down to the lower portion of the anterior rectus sheath, we see a combination of the fascia of the external oblique, 2 layers, of the internal oblique, 2 layers, and also of the transversus abdominis, 2 layers, making this the thickest section or portion of the anterior rectus sheath. Very thick. Back when we're over here, we have just the 2 layers of the external oblique, 2 layers of external oblique, but then we have the 3rd layer here, and here we have 3 more layers. 6 layers, 3 layers, 2 layers. This is Anna's inguinal ring. It's formed beautifully and perfectly in the tendon of the external oblique. So we remember our donors here, Z and Anna, and then we see they're very different but very similar external obliques. Anna's has a much more broad, anterior rectus sheath and thicker muscle tissue, and Z has more narrow anterior rectus sheath and thinner muscle tissue. Z was a big man, but in his illness at the end of his life, he suffered some muscle wasting and became much more thin. So God bless him. I'm grateful to my donors very much. I want to stop for a few minutes in order to get a drink of water, but also maybe to answer some questions. So I have the water here. And I'm going to stop screen sharing, if I can figure out how, for 1 minute. So maybe I can take a couple of questions before I go on to the next section. Will I be able to hear people? Hello?
Hello.
Sorry, I made a technical change and now it's, I hope the translators were able to keep up with me. I'm trying to speak slowly. I'm originally from New Jersey and I speak like very fast. And so I'm like, whoa, slow down.
But it's perfect. And our team of tradition, I don't know.
Translators.
Yes, they are amazing. So it's working in perfect way.
Thank you. And you are amazing because you are speaking to me in English and I am not speaking to you in Portuguese. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And we have do you want to rest a little bit, or you can answer the questions after?
I'm happy to answer questions if people have questions.
Okay. I have one question.
Yeah.
We can think that the perifascia it's similar to the loose connective tissue.
It is exactly that.
Okay.
I am giving a word to something that anatomists call loose areolar connective tissue. But the reason I call it perifascia is because after many years of dissection, I have found that perifascia is not so loose and areolar that it cannot be cut into sheets. I can cut it. You saw me on camera cut the loose areolar connective tissue into a sheet of fascia. So by definition, an aggregate of connective tissue that can be cut into a sheet, is dissectable into a sheet, is a fascia, properly understood. So I feel that if we remember, well, first, if we gain the skill to cut it as a fascia, it's not difficult. Any new student in my class can do what I did. But the thing is, for most of history, nobody has bothered to do that. And so I feel that we have not benefited from the understanding of loose areolar connective tissue as a fascia properly understood. Once we understand it properly as a fascia, then we can start to include it in our more deep understanding of the movement properties of the tissue. I think that most therapists have a keen interest in the movement properties of a tissue, because oftentimes when something is wrong, it's because something is not moving so well. So I feel that if we can understand the movement properties of perifascia, rather than just saying, oh, loose connective tissue, like it might not matter then. But when we identify it properly, then it starts to matter, and we will include it in our therapeutic interventions.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We have here one question from the audience.
Yes.
Fabi,
Oi.
deixa eu fazer uma para ele aqui.
Tá.
Professor Gil, bom dia.
Good morning, Professor Jill. Are you listening to the English translation? First of all, I would like to thank you greatly for accepting our invitation to be here with us. I'm a huge fan of your work, for how gracious your images are, and also for all the respect that you have with the human body. So I'm so thankful for everything that you do for us. And when telling us, when teaching us, when I am teaching fascia, my students always ask the same question about the rectus sheet. Why the third inferior part of this sheet, the rectus abdominis sheet, is different from the two upper thirds? The explanation that I usually give to my students, it's because of the gestational stages. The pelvic volume that changes during the gestation. But I actually have never seen a proper explanation for this question. So I would like to bring this question to you to know your opinion about it.
So when it comes to anatomy, I never can answer the question, why? But I can observe what it is. So when we observe what it is, then we can say, how does this make the function different? Rather than why is it so? Maybe an embryologist can say why it is so, or maybe the creator can say why. Why? Maybe because it's pretty. I don't know. But when I see it, I can say, this is interesting. We have in a biped, an up and down biped, we have more strength where there's more pressure. So it's possible that the fascial organization, I always believe, is a response to movement function. So in a biped, where the pressure organization is more pressure down low and less pressure up high, we see changes in the thickness of the fascia of the chest, where it's thin. In the upper abdomen is more thick than in the chest. In the lower abdomen is more thick than in the middle. So this corresponds to pressure differentials of the visceral spaces. Down low in the pelvis, the pressure is greatest. In the abdomen, there's, let's say in the pelvis, 20 milligrams of mercury. In the abdomen, 15 milligrams of mercury. In the thorax, 0 milligrams of mercury. So pressure differential is most high in the pelvis, then in the abdomen, and then least in the chest. And the fascia matches that. So I'm just noticing this. I'm not telling you that's why. I don't know I can ever know why, but I can observe different functions and see evidence for it in the tissue. You like? Thank you, Leonardo.
Excelente, professor. Muito obrigado.
Excellent, Professor. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions?
Oh, there is. What do you think is the principal reason for the differences between Ana and Z tissue?
Well, lifestyle. So Anna was a grandma. She was maybe 86 years old, and she has the body of grandma. And Z was only 53 years old. And he had the body of a working man. And so that's it. You see, human beings are each individual perfect expressions of the human form. This is why I always like to show more than one body. And this is why I don't like to show pictures. Because I mean, by pictures, I mean drawings or illustrations. When I love drawings and illustrations, but they do not represent any body. They represent no body. Because the body is always very specific and individual. And this is a function of genetics and of lifestyle. It's a function of environment. It's a function of time. So I can look at my body from the past and from now, and if you put them next to each other, you'd say two different people. And actually, in terms of the body, it's true. And so in my brain, as an integral anatomist, we have to always start, if we want to truly understand anatomy of the human body, we have to start with the individual example, not with the average, not with the mean, not with illustration, because that's no body. We have to start with one person and look at it and say, that's a human person. And therefore, that is perfect human anatomy. And then we look at another human person and we say, oh, amazing. Another perfect example of human anatomy, and it's different. That's okay. In integral anatomy, we learn to appreciate the differences from one body to another and add them all together to make one human body. All of us are good examples, perfect examples of human body. And I feel that if we start with individual, then we stop comparing and say, this is how it should be, this is how it should be, should be. And then we always hate ourselves and envy our neighbor. When we start with the individual form and appreciate it as perfect anatomy, then we say, when we look into the mirror of the human race, we can see ourselves, and what is being mirrored to us is individuality, specific beauty represented there. So we see your differences, and I say, oh, you're a different, perfect example of human anatomy too. And no longer do I hate someone because they're different. That's a little speech.
Amazing. People are saying here at the chat that you are an inspiration, you are amazing, you are so kind and gentle. So yeah. and that this is a beautiful way to start a congress.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure. So do we have, thank you. And do we have more questions, or should I continue? Or do you all need a break because I talk too much?
Yeah, we can continue, and later you can ask the questions too.
Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me return to pictures then. Is that good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will figure out, I will change I'm getting good at sharing my screen. I'm not getting good at combing my hair though. It's early, I only just woke up. Okay, share screen. Back to my pictures. By the way, I just want to throw out a hello. I see my friend Jim Ashman in the background. Hi, Jim, I love you.
Sneha is there too.
Oh, and Sneha too. Hi, Sneha. So many friends. Thank you for coming. Okay, so fascial relationships of rectus abdominis. So there are so many layers of the abdominal wall. We have so much to look at. So here we have Anna again. You know my friend Anna. And we have taken away her external obliques. You see how now we see so much of the rib cage. So remember always that in the abdominal wall layers, we also have a particular relationship to the rib cage, or the rib basket, as the Germans like to say. So the external oblique layers of fascia of the abdominal wall go over the rib cage. Also, the fascia of the rectus abdominis goes over the rib cage. So we have this whole section of the rib cage that is wrapped in abdominal muscle and fascia. So in our mind, we separate ourselves here at the costal margin. But this is kind of strange because our liver lives here behind the bone in the abdominal space. And here our spleen and our stomach live inside of the bone here in the abdominal space. So all across here, this whole section is all part of the abdominal space, but it happens to be covered by bone. But our muscle tissue and fascia kind of indicate the relationship by crossing over the rib cage. So external oblique and rectus abdominis go over the rib cage. We see the linea alba here. Now, really, what is the linea alba but the leftovers or the remnant of the tendon of 2 layers of the external oblique and 1 layer of the internal oblique here, right? So from here all the way to here, we see this line. And can you see that it's thicker here and more thin here? Because I was more easily able to differentiate the external oblique, because all through here, we have no more tendinous inscriptions. We have 1 here, we have 1 here, we have 1 here, and then there's a long section of the rectus abdominis with no tendinous inscriptions. You can see that when you see a bodybuilder. You can see all the way from the navel to the pubic bone, there are no more tendinous inscriptions. That means we have differential movement between rectus abdominis and the anterior rectus sheath throughout the whole lower portion of the abdomen. I think that's interesting that we have a longer span of contractile portion here that has a movement relationship with the anterior rectus sheath down low. My fingertips are on top of a little muscle called pyramidalis, which shows up in about 80% of the bodies. And Anna had a pyramidalis and Z did not. The pyramidalis points up and anchors in the linea alba. The xiphoid process points down and anchors in the linea alba. And sometimes I think that part of the function of the pyramidalis is to adjust tension in the linea alba relative to the xiphoid process, because this is a big piezoelectric multi-layered fabric, and maybe this is an antenna. I don't know. Many, many years ago, studying with Jim Ashman at the Rolf Institute, Jim came to the Institute and sat down on a chair and said, I'm going to tell you some stories. And you can think what you like about my stories, but I like my stories. Maybe you'll like my stories. Well, Jim, you set me off on a lifetime of storytelling. And one of my stories is that the pyramidalis and the xiphoid process are tensioning the linea alba as a kind of piezoelectric antenna. So maybe you think that's fun. Anyway, I'm going to switch now. Now, here we are in that lower portion of the rectus abdominis, and I've lifted up the very thick lower portion of the anterior rectus sheath. And can you see here, fuzz? So we have a perifascial relationship between the lower portion of rectus abdominis and the thick section of the anterior rectus sheath inferiorly. So I think that's just good to note the movement properties, right? Because we don't just have a fibrous layer. We also have a membranous layer that's covering the muscle tissue here. You can see, again, I said the anterior rectus sheath is embedded in perifascia, and you can see there's a film of tissue here. We don't look directly at the fibers. We look at the filmy perifascia first. Now, this is in the upper portion of Anna's anterior rectus sheath. We see the rectus abdominis. We see here and here and here the tendinous inscriptions. And I just wanted to note that although the muscle tissue of the internal oblique does not come over the rib cage, and the muscle tissue, remember, of external oblique comes over the rib cage, the fascia of the internal oblique can come over the rib cage a little bit as it creates its layer of the anterior rectus sheath. And you can see here, it's actually going behind the rectus abdominis. And here it's going in front of the rectus abdominis. So the fascia of the internal oblique divides around the rectus abdominis and surrounds it and creates a pocket for it. So here's the tendinous inscription, which I showed you. Here's the linea alba and the navel, or the umbilicus. So the tendinous inscription here, I had to cut it away from the anterior rectus sheath. But if I flip this over, look, I'm lifting with my glove and I'm differentiating the rectus abdominis off of the rib cage. And so I'm lifting it up, I'm going to flip it over. See, here's the rib cage. The rectus abdominis has been flipped back here. And here we're looking at the deep side of rectus abdominis, exactly where the tendinous inscription was. And look, you do not see a tendinous inscription. It's perifascia. So on the deep side of rectus abdominis, the whole deep side is a sliding surface, is a place of shearing, tissue shearing. So all throughout the deep side of rectus abdominis, we have no tendinous inscriptions. The tendinous inscriptions only relate to the anterior rectus sheath. They do not relate to the posterior rectus sheath. So this is a difference in the relationship of the rectus abdominis to its fascia. It has a fibrous, let me go backwards. It has this fibrous relationship in certain places to the anterior rectus sheath, but in the posterior rectus sheath, we do not see that. We see only a long tract of fascia with a membrane that permits differential movement. When these muscle fibers contract, they do not contract on the posterior rectus sheath. They do contract on the anterior rectus sheath. I hope you're getting that difference. I think it's cool, and it's an observation, and I don't know, maybe the therapist can tell me how this might affect movement. And I'm not, I just am thinking, the rectus abdominis does not drag the posterior rectus sheath, but it does drag the anterior rectus sheath. I don't know, we have to think about that. Thinking caps on. So when we look at Z, here we see his rectus abdominis coming over the rib cage. We see these tendinous inscriptions from the front. We see this central fibrous connection here. So we have fibrous connection, perifascial connection between rectus abdominis and the anterior rectus sheath. And then we see Anna and Z together. So again, they are very different bodies, but they're both perfect examples of rectus abdominis. It's like variations on the theme of being human. We see Z more narrow. We see his tendinous inscriptions zigzaggy. We see Anna has a very broad rectus abdominis. I remember when I was a Rolfer and learning Rolfing, I was told, let's gather the rectus abdominis in towards the middle to hope of creating a more functional center line. But I don't see anything dysfunctional about Anna's broad rectus abdominis. She had very powerful musculature throughout her whole body, as did her husband, who I also had the honor to study. So Z and Anna, and here is Anna's pyramidalis, which lived right there. So pyramidalis has perifascial relationship to the rectus abdominis and a fibrous relationship to the linea alba. Oh, when I take a walk, this is where I get to walk. It's so pretty. So fascial relationships now of the internal obliques and the posterior rectus sheath. So the internal obliques we saw contribute to the anterior rectus sheath, but also to the posterior rectus sheath. So we'll look at that now. So we have removed our external obliques and we're looking at Z. We're looking at Z's posterior rectus sheath now, not the anterior, but the posterior, because we've taken away the rectus abdominis from this pocket. These are the muscle fibers now of the internal oblique, and they span from the iliac crest here all the way to the rib cage. But what do you see about the internal oblique fibers? They do not cross over the rib cage. Internal obliques fill in the bony frame here, but they do not exceed the limits of the bony frame. They do not cross over. They go to the costal margin, but they do not go under it and they do not go over it. So the external oblique goes over the ribs. The internal oblique goes to the ribs, and to the iliac crest. Now the external obliques go to the more lateral aspect, or maybe the more anterior aspect of the crest. The internal obliques go on the inside margin of the crest. So if you want to be specific in your touch and you want to contact the tendinous relationship, we can say, oh, the abdominal wall and its fascia goes to the iliac crest. Well, where on the iliac crest does it go? Well, the external oblique goes to the most anterior aspect of the crest, and the internal oblique goes more medial to the iliac crest than the external oblique. Just something to add to your knowledge. Also, of course, the internal oblique goes all the way around the back, as we saw also with the external oblique. But how far? Let's see how far. We'll see in a second. First, I'll show you this fascial covering. So here's the posterior rectus sheath. Look, here's the cut edge of the internal oblique tendon. Cut edge, cut edge, cut edge. Why was it cut there? It was cut there because I could no longer differentiate the tendon from the external oblique fascial layers. So here you can see two things. Well, three things. Muscle fiber, where I've uncovered and peeled away the fascia. Here is the fascial covering of the internal oblique at the external surface that contributes to this anterior rectus sheath. And here is perifascia. So perifascial layer, investing fascial layer of the internal oblique, and then the muscle fibers themselves. And they all look quite different to me. Maybe they do also to you. So here we see I've lifted up the internal oblique tendon where it is fused also with its deeper layer. This is that thick portion, remember. And we can see the pocket for this. I want to point this out here. Z actually had a pathological condition in his peritoneum. The peritoneum became thick and the peritoneum shrank. I mean, it became contracted and pulled away, actually. It pulled away from the pubic bone. And so his bladder ended up up here. I don't imagine he suffered this condition long. I think it was part of his cancer. And it just shows how changes can happen in the body. So what happened here, once I took away the rectus abdominis, the fascia behind it collapsed into the pocket or void that was created by the displacement of his bladder from here to here. So if you look carefully down here, you can see that the posterior rectus sheath is a little thicker here and a little thinner here. It's more thin here and all through here, actually. It's more thin, and you can see there's a line here. Do you see that line? That's the arcuate line. It's here and it's here. So what we have in the posterior rectus sheath is the opposite of the anterior rectus sheath. So the anterior rectus sheath is more thin here and more thick here. The posterior rectus sheath is more thin here and more thick here. So that's interesting. Why is it more thin here? Because all of the layers of the internal oblique and all of the layers of the external oblique and all of the layers of transversus abdominis have gone over the lower portion of rectus abdominis. Well, if the layers have gone over, then what went under? Well, not much. There's not much left to cross over here. So all that's left here is what we call the transversalis fascia. So what we're looking at here actually is not the layers of the obliques or the abdominal musculature, but rather what we call the transversalis fascia. So transversalis fascia is here, and then we see a line, and then we see thickening of the posterior rectus sheath. So here is the edge of those multi-layers on this left side here. And here I've actually stuck my probe underneath the edge formation of the arcuate line. These vessels here are the epigastric artery and vein, and they're branching from below here. There's inferior epigastric goes this way, and we end up having branchings from the uppermost portion of the femoral vein and artery that flip backwards and run up the posterior rectus sheath to nourish the rectus abdominis muscle. So you can see quite clearly here the thicker upper portion of the posterior rectus sheath and the thinner lower portion. And this portion is comprised of the deep side of the fascia of the internal oblique, not the outer side, because that went over the rectus abdominis, but then it divides around it and contributes its lower layer. The internal oblique contributes its deeper layer to the posterior rectus sheath, as does the transversus abdominis. So we have three layers here. The one we're looking at now is from the internal oblique, and then deeper to this, we have the layers from the transversus abdominis as well as the transversalis fascia. So it's thicker here and thinner here. This, by the way, is my grandma's walnut pick that I had in childhood, and I've used it for dissection ever since, and I always think of my grandma when I dissect. Okay, so the testicle here, you see Z's testicle and the spermatic cord are coming, as a visceral projection out of the abdominal wall, but they don't do it alone. They do it with the layers of the internal oblique. So if I look very closely at the spermatic cord, I can see that the muscle wall and fascia of the internal oblique have actually extended and expanded beyond the frame of the abdomen to include the spermatic cord, and this muscle fiber here now goes like this, and it becomes the cremaster muscle. So the cremaster muscle lifts the testicle. All you fellas out there, you know what I'm talking about. If you just kind of pull up on that, yeah, lift your balls now. This is your, lift your balls, come on. Are you lifting your balls? You're doing it with your cremaster muscle. And if you're lifting your balls with your cremaster muscle, that means you're also contracting your internal oblique. You can put them down now. So So do my jokes translate? Does it work? So here we're looking also at the spermatic cord being pulled up. You can see the muscle fibers of the internal oblique, the fascia as well. And this is actually the cut edge of the external oblique. So the external oblique, when you cut the external oblique away, the remaining fascia that you didn't get, we call that the inguinal ligament. The inguinal ligament is nothing more than the lower edge of the fascia of our tendon of the external oblique. So now we have Z prone. He's lying down on his tummy. This is the inferior angle of the scapula, the rib cage, the ilium here, the pelvis. So you get the position. And we're looking all here at the edge of the internal oblique. So internal oblique, internal oblique, internal oblique, internal oblique. All this is the internal oblique. You can't really see it all from one position, so you have to turn the body. And you can see that the fascial covering has been removed of the internal oblique, but there's still some remnants of it left. And I did that because if I didn't take away the fascia, you wouldn't know that it was the internal oblique. You just say, Gil, I don't see anything. So, but if you look carefully at this edge, we're going to dissect this edge here. And is this not the internal oblique? No, this is not the internal oblique. This is deeper than the internal oblique. This more filmy fascia that covers the internal oblique blends here and dissipates. And we have a layering here of the tendon of the transversus abdominis, which we can see goes much further than the fibers of the internal oblique. So there's another angle to see the whole internal oblique from pelvis to rib cage and wrapping around the back. It's very pretty. Now here, you can see the tendon of transversus abdominis that's deep. That's a fascia that's deep to the internal oblique. The internal oblique is here. And as I push it away, you can see this white tendon. Now, the reason why this is not so white is because it's covered in oxidized perifascia. And as I take away more, then the dissection is new again. And this is not yet oxidized, so it's white. So this is the same tendon all through here of the transversus abdominis. And you can see the way that the edge of the internal oblique fascia blends into the perifascia over the transversus abdominis tendon. And what was taken away from here was the external oblique, right? And the latissimus dorsi. So they're missing now. Latissimus dorsi was most external. Then the external oblique has been cut away from here. And now we have the internal oblique. And we see, again, perifascia. Between external and internal oblique, we have perifascia. Between internal oblique and transversus abdominis, we have perifascia. We have to include our understanding of, in our understanding of the abdominal wall, perifascia at each layer where there's differential movement. And if we do not have differential movement in somebody, it's because they're stuck in there, right? It is possible that the fluidity of the perifascia can diminish and that our abdominal layers can lose their potential for differential movement. It can also regain the potential for differential movement if we learn to engage the different layers of the tissue. Then the body calls for movement. We can refresh our movement. Here you can see there's some thickness to the fascia on the deep side of the internal oblique. Remember that this fascia on the deep side of the internal oblique is going to be contributing to the posterior rectus sheath, but also notice this. You see we have our inferior epigastric artery and vein running between the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis muscle to nourish these muscles. And so wherever we see pathways for viscera, I call this viscera, wherever we, because that's the heart, right? and nerves going through here. Whenever we see pathways for viscera, we also will see them embedded in their own fascia as well as the fascia of the muscles. So here I've lifted off a great deal more of the internal oblique. You see that epigastric artery and vein, and you can see now the revelation of the tendon of transversus abdominis here and the muscle fiber of transversus abdominis as I reflect the internal oblique. I have to flip the body now and come to the front to continue the dissection. And do you see how I have to cut the internal oblique away from the costal margin? I have to cut it away from the ribs. I did not have to do that so much with the external oblique, which had a perifascial relationship all through here with the rib cage and anchored down at the serrations where it interdigitates with the serratus anterior. And then here, all over here, we had the rectus abdominis moving over the rib cage and the external oblique moving over the rib cage. But the internal oblique, I have to cut it off of the costal margin. I also have to cut it off of the iliac crest. And here you see its fascia. When I flip it over, you can see the fascia on the deep side. Now, here's the thing, folks. It looks very clean here, and there's a lot of fascia here. You saw the perifascia in between the two. The truth is, this is really kind of a fascial system here between the two muscles. And I can put my knife very close to here and bring most of it to this side. I could also have put my knife here and left most of this over on this side. You see, it's up to the dissector to put the fascia where you want, right? So you have to realize how much is artifact. And so when we make our models, it's always good to come back to the cadaver and play with a knife to realize it doesn't have to be this way. Just because someone made a drawing and sold the book for 100 years doesn't mean that's the only way that the tissue can be cut. So oftentimes the anatomy that we teach and the anatomy that we believe in is simply a function of our cutting habits, the way that we cut the tissue. It's not about the way that we cut the tissue, we might do it because it's easier. And maybe it's easy because some anatomical reason. So I'm going further and further. I'm showing you that this deep side of internal oblique, this is what's going to contribute to the posterior rectus sheath. And there it is. So here's the outside of posterior rectus sheath. The internal oblique contributes to the outside, the anterior rectus sheath. And then the posterior side, where'd it go? The posterior side here contributes to the posterior rectus sheath. Or the deep contributes to the deep, and the surface contributes to the surface. Now I'm going very far, and look, now I'm starting to see the tendon of the transversus abdominis showing up. Here I see perifascia, or fuzz. It was here too, but I cut it away. Here we see that hole, and we have some scar tissue here. I had to work a little harder to cut the scar tissue away from this hole. But you can see that there is a covering here on the transversus abdominis that's more clear here than here. And that could just be the way that I cut it. I really can't say. But now look, can you see how you can see more of the costal margin is appearing because I've cut the internal oblique away from the costal margin. More of the iliac crest is appearing because I've cut it away. And you can see this little leftover muscle tissue is from the internal oblique connecting to the more medial aspect of the crest. So there's our internal oblique. And if now what do I have to do? Now I have to cut away the last portion of the tendon of the internal oblique. And when I do so, I'm essentially cutting it away from the posterior rectus sheath. So I cut it and I create a thing. This is like an anatomical abstraction of Z's internal oblique with its tendon, the muscle tissue that went all the way around the back, that followed the crest, that followed the rib cage. So it has fibrous relationships, bony relationships. Here it had a perifascial relationship, remember, then a bony relationship. And then all through here, it had a perifascial relationship with the external oblique. And now we see the whole transversus abdominis muscle shining through and contributing to the posterior rectus sheath. So that's Anna's internal obliques here and Z's internal obliques. This was a pattern throughout their bodies. Anna's muscle tissue was always larger and more thick and more broad, very predictably. When we got to the bony layer, Z's bones were a bit stronger than Anna's. She was an elderly woman with some osteoporosis. And although she had big, strong muscles, her bones were suffering some demineralization, whereas Z's bones were the very strong, robust bones. So it was very interesting to see the differences between their muscle layer and their bony layer. Oh, it's always good to look at the trees in the sky once in a while. So now we're going to look at the fascial relationships of transversus abdominis. More layers. So we're going to start on the outside. Now, I love this picture. This is a Z. Now you can see his internal obliques have been removed. His external obliques have been removed. His rectus abdominis has been removed. Now, what are we looking at? How come we still see the posterior rectus sheath is intact? It looks like the beginning. It looks like it's as if we started all over again, right? With the, if you remember, when we had the external obliques and we saw the anterior rectus sheath, now that's all gone. And yet still we see this structure here, right? We still see the linea alba. And look at what we see here. This is the cut edge of the internal oblique because it fused in its posterior aspect with the posterior rectus sheath and the fascia of the transversus abdominis. So internal oblique deep layer and both layers of transversus abdominis have fused here to create this panel, this tough fabric. And down here, we see the arcuate line here and here. Also, notice that the transversus abdominis is even further down in the pelvic bowl. We can see right along here where the external oblique was anchored. We can see right along here where the internal oblique was. And now we're further into the pelvic bowl to get to the relationship of the transversus abdominis to the ilium. Also, here, can you see we're quite deep now? When we started out, we couldn't see the rib cage. Then we saw the internal oblique going to the rib cage. Well, the transversus abdominis and its fascia go underneath the rib cage to interdigitate with the diaphragm. I'll show you clearly how that happens. But for now, I just want you to see the depth that we're looking into it, and that to understand that the fascia of the transversus abdominis goes deep to the costal margin to be continuous with the diaphragm, whereas the internal oblique came to the costal margin and external went over the rib cage. If we look very closely, we can see that thickness, and we can see this cut edge of internal oblique and the fusion of the fascia. This is normal. This is not an aberrant adhesion. It's the normal organization of the posterior rectus sheath. Here, I'm just showing my finger on the crest to show you how deep in the relationship of the muscle tissue is to the bone here. And also we can see super clearly now. Now this is interesting to me. Z had an interesting presentation of his arcuate line here, because you can see it's very thick and clear here. And then we lose a couple layers, and then we see kind of a secondary arcuate line. That was just interesting. And I have a feeling that what we're looking at here is the combination of the internal oblique and the transversus abdominis fascia, and that here we've lost the fascia of the internal oblique because it went over the top, and we still have some of the fascia from the transversus abdominis in combination with the transversalis fascia. So we have a little variation here in the distribution of the fascia in the posterior rectus sheath, which I thought was interesting. We can see that again here. We see kind of a double arcuate line, at least on this side. Now here, what do we have? This tissue has been out for 7 months now, I think, in this image. So it's a little oxidized, but we see the femoral nerve, the femoral artery, the femoral vein, and the spermatic cord, same on this side, femoral nerve, femoral artery, femoral vein, and spermatic cord. And you see how intimately related they are to the fascia of the transversus abdominis. In fact, if we look here and we look here, these are actually expansions of the transversalis fascia called the interfoveolar ligament, which are basically expansions of the transversalis fascia, which is all through here now, that create kind of a loop-de-loop for the spermatic cord that goes around that way. There's, again, the interfoveolar ligament, which is an expansion of the transversalis fascia. Now, what is the relationship of the transversalis fascia to the transversus abdominis muscle? Basically, it's the back side of it. So the fascia on the deep side of the transversus abdominis we call transversalis fascia. There is some argument between surgeons and anatomists and about the transversalis fascia, and maybe we'll look more closely at it further along. So here again, just looking very closely at this multiple distribution of fascia in the wall here. Also, we see the cut edge of the internal oblique tendon. So it's quite big. Transversus abdominis takes its name from the direction of its fibers. So the external oblique fibers, you remember, were coming down this way, and the internal oblique fibers we saw. But look at this, the transversus abdominis fibers are straight across, but it's not really straight. It's actually, excuse me, it's actually an arc, right? Because this is curved. This is not straight. We're not flat. This is not a flat body. This is a cylinder, right? So although we call it transversus abdominis, and it is, the fibers are going across, they're actually going around. We should call it aroundus abdominis. I don't know if that translates, but the fibers are going around rather than straight. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures in the whole collection here. Why? Well, we see our ribs here, and we see our cartilage from the costal margin. Here we see our 10th rib is floating, and our 9th rib is anchored into the costal margin. We see the straight fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle going this way. What are these fibers? Is that the intercostal muscle tissue? No, this is not the intercostal muscle tissue. This is the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm. Do you see the muscle fibers going up and down here? And then we don't see them. This is the pleura, the parietal pleura. All of the intercostal muscles have been removed from the intercostal space. I took away the intercostal muscles on down to the pleura. And this cut edge here is the end of the pleural sac. I've opened it so you can see that there's a pathway. This is a pathway into the thorax here. And the pleura is, the parietal pleura, the wall layer, is lining the rib cage. And then it gets to this point and it goes back up. So it comes down the rib cage and then it goes over the diaphragm and creates a pocket here. And we can see into the pocket. But here the pleura does not reach down and there's a bare area of the diaphragm. So the thorax doesn't come all the way down here, it stops here. And so when we take away the intercostal muscles, we find ourselves looking at the diaphragm through this window. And can you see the fiber direction is exactly at right angles to the transversus abdominis. So we have diaphragm coming down this way, and we have transversus coming this way, and they're actually interdigitating along the costal margin. If we took this bone away here, we would see the fibers of the diaphragm and the fibers of transversus abdominis at right angles to each other. They are continuous. The diaphragm and the transversus abdominis are continuous, and therefore their fascia is continuous. The fascia of the abdominal wall should be understood to include the coverings of the diaphragm. I'll show that in clearer detail in more pictures, but I love this picture because it shows you the fiber direction of the diaphragm, the fiber direction of the abdominal wall, and the fact that they're actually in the same layer behind the bone. So this is emphasizing the fact that the transversus abdominis goes under the rib cage and interdigitates with the diaphragm. When you think about the abdominal wall and its fascia, you must include the diaphragm. The diaphragm is part of the abdominal muscular sac. So here I'm just showing again in side lying disease transversus abdominis that comes all the way around to the back, and I think I'm going to flip him in a second. Yes. So now we're in the back. Here's Z's spine, lumbar spine. Here's his 11th rib. Here's his 12th rib. Here's his 10th rib. And here is transversus abdominis coming around the back. And now with the internal and external obliques removed, with the latissimus dorsi removed, we can see the full extent of the fascia of transversus abdominis. So transversus abdominis is truly a back thing because it has a very dense tendon here that actually crosses over quadratus lumborum. If we look at quadratus lumborum here, you can see I've uncovered it partly. Here, quadratus lumborum is covered. Here's the 12th rib. Here's the edge. I don't know if you can see it. See how it's a little more brown here? Here's the edge of quadratus lumborum, deep to the tendon of transversus abdominis. Here's the tendon of transversus abdominis. Here's muscle fiber of transversus abdominis. Here's tendon of transversus abdominis. And the tendon crosses over posterior to the quadratus lumborum muscle. I don't like to call it quadratus lumborum. I want to call it triangularis lumborum because 99% of the time, the quadratus lumborum has a triangular shape. I've dissected about 450 cadavers, and 2 times I've seen a quadrate-shaped quadratus lumborum. All the other times, it's a triangle. I'm just saying, I don't know why, but I think that Netter saw one quadrate-shaped quadratus lumborum and decided, I'm going to draw that one. Anyway, so what's important here, though, for your understanding of the fascia of the abdominal wall is that at the layer of transversus abdominis, it comes all the way to the spine. I think that's amazing. And also, the quadratus lumborum then can be said to be invested in the same fascia as the transversus abdominis. I just thought that's an amazing flower. It reminds me of the pinwheels that I used to get when I was a kid. So fascial relationships of transversus abdominis from the deep side. Now I've shown you the fascia of transversus abdominis on the surface. Now I'm going to show it to you on the deep side. So here we are. Here's quadratus lumborum. Remember, you just saw it. We're very close in. This is the crest, iliac crest. This is the 11th rib. This is the 12th rib. Here's those diaphragm fibers between the 11th and the 12th rib. Here's pleura, and here's the anchoring of the tendon of transversus abdominis to the tip of the 12th rib. Now, there was a story told at the Rolf Institute, but Ida Rolf was asked, Dr. Rolf was asked, if you had to Rolf the entire body from one spot, what spot on the body would that be? And she said, the 12th rib. And Rolfers have been trying to understand why she said that ever since. But I just think it's interesting to see how the tip of the 12th rib is guided here by the tendon of transversus abdominis. I have to cut it away though. So I cut it away from the 12th rib and I lift underneath. What do I see? Perifascia. And I see a covering. So the covering of the deep side of transversus abdominis muscle, I'm going to show you more and more of, and we're going to discuss it. See, there's perifascia. There's a shearing relationship of transversus abdominis to the underlying tissues. Here's now the edge of quadratus lumborum. Here's the 11th rib, and I'm basically cutting away the back portion of transversus abdominis. I go further and further. I see perifascia the whole time. I see how it actually is going underneath the rib here, right? It's going underneath the 10th rib now to meet up with what? With the diaphragm. This is fascia over the diaphragm. This is, the fascia is continuous between the diaphragm and the transversus abdominis. And I have to cut the transversus abdominis away from the diaphragm. I'm not really cutting it away from the ribs. I'm cutting it away from the diaphragm. I could have cut it differently. I could have cut the ribs away and shown you the continuity of transversus abdominis and the diaphragm. I do that in other videos. But in this video, I was choosing to, in this image, I'm trying to show just the transversus abdominis as if it were its own thing. But I hope you'll look at other videos where I show the direct relationship. There's one on YouTube, actually, about the diaphragm and transversus abdominis. So now look at this. I've got a big swath of transversus abdominis. You see its straight fibers here. You see its fascial covering. Now, transversus abdominis is invested in fascia. What we choose to call that fascia, we can argue about it all day long. and people do, just so you know. So surgeons call things one thing, anatomists call things one thing. They're all very confident in their language. People from one country call it one thing. People from another country call it another thing. I'm keen to show you the anatomy. You can decide what you want to call it. But for now, I'll tell you what I call it. So I kind of agree with the surgeons about this tissue, and I call this the transversalis fascia. Now, if you look at Netter, he'll draw an extra line, a little black line underneath the investment of the transversus abdominis muscle. He'll draw a little black line in cross-section, and he'll say transversalis fascia, and then above that line, he'll say investment of transversus abdominis, and distinguish between the investment of transversus abdominis and transversalis fascia. I cannot dissect that apart. It is much easier to draw one line in a book than it is to actually deal with the tissue. And if you look at this, I'm going to show you this fascia. Look, I can get underneath it, and I can flip it back. And you see the muscle fibers are rooted on the fascia. That's an indication that it's an investing fascia. This is the transversalis fascia, folks, as far as I can tell. So the transversalis fascia invests the deep side of transversus abdominis. Then there's perifascia here, And then there's some fatty tissue, and we're going to talk about that fatty tissue quite a bit. So here I'm continuing to differentiate the transversalis fascia now from the peritoneum. Over here, I have fat. Over here, I do not have fat. So there's actually an extra layer in the lower portion here between transversalis fascia and peritoneum. So we're going to talk about that more, but I'm just giving you the first look. So I'm continuing to lift up the transversus abdominis with its fascial covering, which I'm calling transversalis fascia, and we're revealing Z's peritoneum. Again, I just cut the perifascia here. It's very easy to do at this point where there's fatty tissue. The more fatty tissue there is, the easier it is to differentiate transversalis fascia from the peritoneum. So there's differential movement all through here. In the lower part of the abdomen, there is differential movement between the peritoneum and the transversalis fascia. I gotta say thank you to Carla Stecco for pointing this out. In 2016, I was at the British Fascia Symposium, and Carla was there also, and she gave a lecture on visceral fascia. It was very interesting and excellent. Thank you, Carla. And in that discussion, she said that there was differential movement between the peritoneum and the transversalis fascia. And I was like, are Italian bodies different than American bodies? Because I always have to tear apart the adhesions of transversalis fascia and the peritoneum, which seem very normal. I see it in every single body, and she's saying that they move. Well, we had another discussion about a year and a half ago in Berlin, not Berlin, Guben, Germany, and we were standing over a cadaver together, and what we realized was that both perceptions are true. Down low, there's differential movement between the transversalis fascia and the peritoneum because there's fatty tissue here. Up high, as we go further up, the transversalis fascia starts to fuse with the peritoneum. So I was accustomed to attempting to differentiate them up here. She was accustomed to differentiating them down here. And there in Germany, we realized that both facts are true. There's differential movement down here, and there's fixation up here, and that is normal anatomy. I'll show it to you even more carefully. So look here. Do you see what happened? We have this nice covering of transversalis fascia on the deep side of the transversus abdominis. We can see the tendon of transversus abdominis forming here to form the posterior rectus sheath. But what about here? How come it's bare? How come it's naked? What happened to the fascia that was covering transversus abdominis? What happened to the transversalis fascia? It got stuck. This is normal. Just like we saw when we were dissecting the external oblique and the internal oblique tendons from the posterior rectus sheath, and we had to eventually cut them because they were fusing. Here in the upper portion of the relationship of transversalis fascia and peritoneum, they fuse. You see that? All through this area, we're looking now at transversalis fascia, not peritoneum. This is the peritoneum. This is the fusion line of the peritoneum and the transversalis fascia, and therefore these were more strongly connected than was the transversalis fascia to the muscle it was investing. So we start to see fibers of muscle tissue because this is their investment, and now it's fused to the peritoneum. Does that make sense? I hope so. It took me years, literally years, to see that and figure it out. Because if you don't pay very, very close attention while you're dissecting, you won't notice that you left a layer behind. And then you won't see that the layer is still down here and no longer coming along with your dissection. So it took me a long time of thinking about this and paying attention to be able to notice this difference between the lower portion of the relationship of transversus abdominis and the peritoneum and its fascia, the transversalis fascia. It took me a long time to notice that they were moving relative to each other here and that they were fused here. So here it's even more dramatic because I've gone farther. So all of this here is transversalis fascia fused to the peritoneum. And all of this is the peritoneum where it had a perifascial relationship to the transversalis fascia. And this fatty body here, I call it extraperitoneal adipose. There are some osteopaths who call this fascia propria. The fascia propria goes down into the pelvis. This is continuous with that. So maybe we could call this fascia propria, this adiposal fascia. Maybe I like to call it extraperitoneal adipose because of its location. You see, it's deep to the transversalis fascia, but it's external to the peritoneum. Here we're looking very closely now at the cut edge of transversalis fascia, where it's fused here with the peritoneum. Here's the peritoneum. Here's the cut edge of transversalis fascia. Here's muscle fiber from transversus abdominis because transversalis fascia is the investment of the deep side of transversus abdominis muscle. Now we come around to the front, and what I did was I just kept going. I went all the way across. So here's the linea alba here. Here's the posterior rectus sheath on the deep side, transversus abdominis, and I just dissected it as one giant muscle from lumbar spine all the way around to the next, to the middle, and then I just kept on going until it was just one big thing. And so this is the lumbar aspect and the tendon of transversus abdominis here and way out here. Here are the fibers of transversus abdominis, and here's the posterior rectus sheath that it forms. And you can see the fusion line with the internal oblique fascia here, and then it got thin down here and I had to cut it. So that's Z's transversus abdominis muscle, and you can see it looks flat now. It looks like a big sheet, but it was really, you know, when you get out of the shower and you wrap a towel all the way around your waist, and that's this. This is the towel that you wrap around your waist. And here's Anna, and I'll briefly show you some features on Anna and her transversus abdominis muscle. So here we are, transversus abdominis of Anna. It's much thicker. Again, it's covering. It's here. I did not uncover the quadratus lumborum. So the fascia and tendon of the transversus abdominis are investing and covering quadratus lumborum. I lift it up, and now we expose quadratus lumborum, and we expose the fascia propria, or what we can also call the extraperitoneal fat. So we haven't quite gotten to the peritoneum yet because of this fatty tissue that we also saw on Z. And as I lift away the transversus abdominis, you can see the transversalis fascia here. You can see the fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal fatty tissue here, and quadratus lumborum as I'm cutting the transversus abdominis away from the diaphragm again. If we look very closely, we can see how many layers. Well, between transversalis fascia here and fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal fat, we have perifascia. We actually have like transversalis fascia, then perifascia, then fascia propria, then more perifascia, then peritoneum. We have movement. This is the point. We have movement where we have the presence of perifascia, where we have the presence of a fatty layer, we have movement. That's some clouds right outside my house the other day, and it looked like that little fatty layer to me. So I threw it in here because it was pretty. Okay, So here we see the transversalis fascia, and then the exact same thing happens on Anna. Look, here's the rib cage. Here's the upper portion of transversus abdominis. Here's the lower portion. So we see here it's smooth. It's smooth because the transversalis fascia is intact. Here now we see the muscle tissue exposed because the same thing happened. When I'm cutting it, the transversalis fascia starts to become more strongly adherent to the peritoneum. I can't get them apart. So it strips away the fascia from the transversus abdominis muscle. It gets stripped away when we get to the upper portion because it's so strongly adherent and connected and continuous with no differential movement between transversalis fascia and peritoneum in the upper portion. So here's Z's transversus abdominis muscle with uncut. So I made one big muscle that wraps around your waist like a belt or a towel. And Anna was a little bit more of a waist, so she had a little bit more of a transversus abdominis muscle. But you can see it's a very long span, right, to go all the way around. The only thing missing, this is like Moscow. And then if you go all the way back around the other side of the world, you get to Siberia, right? So Siberia to Moscow, and then here's Europe and the Atlantic Ocean and the United States and Canada, and here's Alaska here. And we've gone around the whole globe of the belly. I think, do you have more attention span, or should you have, Leonardo, can you keep listening, or do you need a break? Okay, I'm going to continue then. Transversalis fascia at the respiratory diaphragm. This is cool. I love this. So now you saw that I removed the transversus abdominis muscle. And you saw that it had on Z and Anna a naked part here where the transversalis fascia came away. Well, here I've lifted it up now, that naked part. And so what we're looking at here is peritoneum. Here's the fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal fat. And this is transversalis fascia here. Same tissue from a different angle now. Here's the peritoneum. Here's the fascia propria. Here's the transversalis fascia. Fused. At this point, it's fused and conjoined with the peritoneum. So what happens up here? Look, I'm holding the transversalis fascia. You can see the fibers, little fibers from transversus abdominis that remain behind, right? So it's investing transversus abdominis. That means that all through here, this is all transversalis fascia. All transversalis fascia fused to the peritoneum. So we have an external layer, transversalis fascia, and a deeper layer, peritoneum. But look what's going underneath the rib cage now. We took away the muscle tissue of transversus abdominis, and we can see that we cut it away from the diaphragm here. These are diaphragm fibers, and this is transversalis fascia. Now, if I cut the if I cut the diaphragm fibers away from transversalis fascia, I start to see some fuzz, and the transversalis fascia is going along. It was investing the diaphragm. Transversalis fascia that's investing transversus abdominis muscle is also investing the diaphragm. The same way that the muscle fiber is continuous, also the fascia is continuous. Look, I go further and I expose more diaphragm fibers, and now they're naked because their transversalis fascia and some perifascia too has been differentiated from them. I'm using my hand and pushing, I'm pulling, and using my knife and cutting the transversalis. The layer that's in contact with the diaphragm fibers is transversalis fascia. The peritoneum is deep to this. So here we have a more of it. I'm lifting up the rib cage. I'm showing you the diaphragm fibers here coming to the costal margin where they interdigitated with the transversus abdominis, and all of this is transversalis fascia now dropped down and exposed. All of this, I can keep going. I can keep going over the whole diaphragm, in fact. The whole diaphragm is invested in transversalis fascia. The peritoneum is deep or more internal of a layer. That's another perspective. So again, we have fascia propria over here. We have peritoneum exposed, and then we get into the upper portion and we're looking at transversalis fascia all through here. This is Anna, same thing. Transversalis fascia is under my finger. Peritoneum is on the other side. It's a double layer. This is the peritoneum. We're inside the peritoneum. You see, now we see organs. Finally, we see the organs, right? We're in the abdominal fascia. We're seeing organs now because this is the parietal peritoneum. And this is the transversalis fascia. Parietal peritoneum, transversalis fascia. Transversalis fascia on the outside, parietal peritoneum on the inside. So extraperitoneal adipose. Let's try and make some sense of this fascia propria, which we also call extraperitoneal adipose. I do. That's what I call it. So look, here we are at, we're looking at, who do we have here? I think it's Z. No, it's Anna. So I have grabbed the edge. Can you see? It's a fascia. This extraperitoneal fat is not just blobs of loose fatty tissue. It's organized. The fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal adipose, is an organized fatty fascia. It's an aggregate of tissues that I can cut into a sheet very predictably. Here, I'm cutting more of it away, and there's perifascia between it and what's underneath it, which is going to be the peritoneum. Now, the peritoneum just looks like another layer of fat because it's see-through. It's translucent. I can see through it to fat deep to it. But this is a different layer. It's very organized. It's very predictable. But the difference between the fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal adipose, the difference between it and the transversalis fascia, the difference between it and the peritoneum is that it doesn't go all the way around. It does not completely invest the abdominal wall. It's just down low and on the sides. So here, look, I can get my finger on this side, and what am I touching? I'm touching the inside of the iliac fossa. So this away the external oblique, I cut away the internal oblique, I cut away the transversus abdominis, and I see a fascial edge here. That's the transversalis fascia now covering the iliacus muscle. They call it the iliac fascia in books, but it's the same tissue. The iliac fascia is the transversalis fascia. It's not a separate one. So when you look at the ilium, it's covered in fat, and then it's covered in a fibrous fascia. The transversalis fascia was cut here from the abdominal wall, continues over the ilium, and then it continues over the psoas as well. So, but first we have to, so we have peritoneum, fascia propria, transversalis fascia. And what do we find in between them? More perifascia. You see that? This is a fascial layer. It's very thin, but it's what permits there to be movement of this organized fatty layer and the peritoneum. So we have so many layers. We have transversalis fascia, then we have perifascia, then we have the organized fatty layer of fascia propria, then we have more perifascia, then we have the peritoneum. Here I'm grabbing the peritoneum. The fat here is underneath it in her abdomen. This is the peritoneum. The perifascia I've disrupted, and this is the fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal adipose on the lateral side of the body and also down low. Here you can see I have the edge. I have an edge here, but what fascia is this? This is really going to get annoying because it's different from all the other ones. This is actually the investment of the colon. So this is the peritoneum, and the descending colon is deep to the peritoneum. The peritoneum ends here, and then we have an investment of it. So we have fascia propria, we have fatty tissue, and then we have the investment of the colon here. So it just goes on and on. I'm not going to take you deep into the viscera. That would be a whole other lecture, but I just want you to see these relationships and that they're consistent. They're consistent from body to body. So here we'll do the same thing on Z. He has much less adipose, but he still has a layer here. Look, this is the fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal fat on Z. Here's the perifascia again. Here's the perifascia. Here's the extraperitoneal fat. Here is the edge of the peritoneum. And this is going to be the colon. This is his colon, his ascending colon, right? And it has its own layer. I can cut it away. And look, here's the peritoneum. Here's the investment of the ascending colon. Here's the fascia propria. And a little more perifascia. See, so I'm exposing the colon now. It has its own fascial tunic, and this is the peritoneum rolling over it. Here's all this is peritoneum, and then it rolls right over the colon. Z is a special case that enables us to see this clearly because he had a very thick peritoneum. And that enables us to see the relationship. Sometimes the pathology is what enables you to see a relationship most clearly. So this is peritoneum. This is the ascending colon. This is the tunic that wraps the ascending colon. This is the fascia propria, also known as extraperitoneal adipose. And then we have all of our peritoneum over here. So where are we now? Oh, we're looking on the other side of Z. Again, it just repeats. It's the same thing. See, here we have our fascia propria, or the extraperitoneal fat. It covers the ileum on the inside over the iliacus, which will have the remnant of the transversalis fascia. Here we have our beautiful peritoneum, but it's very thick. You see, we can't see through Z's peritoneum. But we can see that colon, all right? It just appears there. So you get the idea, I think. So the peritoneum, I just have a few slides on this. This goes way back 15 years ago. This is Mr. Agape, and this was the first time that I was ever able to do this dissection of the whole peritoneum. You can see here, actually, we have the double layer. This is the transversalis fascia here, where I couldn't get it away. I took it off of the diaphragm, transversalis fascia. Then it just becomes strictly peritoneum all through here. And if I lift up that sac, I lift up that bag you just saw. Let's look at it. Oops, sorry. Here's the sac, and I'm going to pick it up right here to show you the psoas. Here's the psoas, and here's the iliacus. We see the remnant of the fascia propria here, and we see the transversalis fascia that's wrapped around from transversus abdominis, come all the way to the crest, covered the iliacus here. This is iliacus covered in transversalis fascia, and then it crosses right over and covers the psoas. So it's very extensive, the transversalis fascia, but I'm slowly starting to understand its extent. Here is Anna's peritoneum. See, there's no, we can see right through it, and it was covering this fat, and that's why it looked fatty. Here's the fascia propria outside of the peritoneum. Here's the peritoneum. It's very thin and translucent. Z's peritoneum was very thick, right? So here's the double layer. There's our transversalis fascia all through here. And here we were able to differentiate transversalis fascia with the abdomen. So this is just the peritoneum, and you can't see through it. He had a thickening of the peritoneum, as I mentioned, that actually pulled his bladder away from the pubic bone. But as I lift up at the umbilicus, you can see the organization of the peritoneum that includes the median umbilical ligament, the medial umbilical ligaments, the lateral umbilical ligaments, and the round ligament of the liver. All of that would be on the deep side of the peritoneum. But I'm just lifting it up to show you how thick it is and that you can't see through it. And when I cut it, look at that. That's the thickest peritoneum I've ever seen in my whole career. The peritoneum is normally very diaphanous and thin and transparent. And Z's peritoneum was very thick and opaque. Now, this is a different body altogether, but I thought it was a beautiful picture. This is Art. We saw his belly wall much earlier, but here is an image of the transversalis fascia of Art, the peritoneum of Art. You can see that's a very typical presentation of a peritoneum, very thin and transparent. And here's the extraperitoneal fatty layer between the transversalis fascia and the peritoneum. See, here's transversalis fascia. The fat goes underneath it and over the peritoneum. So layer 1, transversalis fascia. Layer 2, extraperitoneal fat that permits differential movement with the peritoneum. Woo! Oh my gosh, that's a lot of pictures. Woohoo! That was 200 slides, folks. I made this list. I'm not going to read through it, but it's all the layers that we talked about, all in a row. So there you go. There's your belly wall in words, all through here. And you can, I don't know, look at the recording and read all that, because who wants to do that now? It's too exhausting. My brain is going to explode. So I'm going to change my screen share now and see if there are any questions. If you still want to chat. Oh, you're very kind. How do I unshare this? Stop share. Stop share.
Está todo mundo fascinado aí.
Thank you so much, Professor. Everyone loved it. Everyone was in love with these images. And let me give you a reminder. Please, if you're here in the audience, do not take pictures of the pictures that the professor has shared with us, and please don't post them in social media. We are now going to have our Q&A session, and we have Leonardo Setti and Fabiana, who will be our moderators. Hello again, everyone. We'll be asking questions in Portuguese, and if necessary, we can switch to English. We have a few questions here, and if you have any questions, just let me know. And this was amazing. Time flew by. No one wanted to stop. And everyone is saying in the chat that this was amazing. Congratulations to our master. Professor Joe, can you hear me? Because Carla, we have simultaneous translation, so you can choose English so that the professor can hear our simultaneous translation. No, that's okay. I'll translate here.
She was saying that there's something there that you can do so you could hear.
Yes, interpretation.
Yes, we have the interpretation button. Can you hear me, Professor? This is your translator speaking. Great,
how cool is that?
Quer falar aí, Léo?
Yeah.
Do you want to continue, Leo? Of course. Hi, Professor. Once again, thank you so much this was delightful. And by the way, folks, Professor Gil has a website, and he offers a number of trainings, a number of DVDs on his website, extremely high quality material, and he's always respectful when it comes to anatomy, as you could clearly see. It's really delightful. Once again, Professor, thank you so much. Everyone loved your talk.
Yay.
I think we could spend the whole day here together.
Yeah. I have a million more pictures. Also,
Gostaria
all
de
of,
fazer
oh, a
uma
question.
pergunta a respeito da fascia
We
thoracolombar.
have a question regarding the thoracolumbar fascia. I know that this is a structure that sometimes is a bit tricky because of the complexity of this structure. So let me ask you a question. What about the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia? We have a model with 2 layers that have been described by Franco Miller and by you. Been models with 2 or 3 layers. So why do some authors do not include the psoas fascia in the anterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia? But in the 3-layered model, the anterior layer is included in a set with the psoas layer and the thoracolumbar layer. So why do we see this difference between descriptions between authors? Why do some authors do not think that the psoas layer is in this group?
It's a good question. And dealing with something as complicated as the human form or any material form, it's to be expected that smart people will come up with different ways of describing this complexity. So I feel that it's good to have different descriptions. And sometimes people will include more or less, depending upon line. But what's important, I think, to remember for all of us is that the body is consistent in wrapping itself. But it's so complicated that it's fair. It's fair that there be multiple ways of breaking it down to simplify it in our descriptions. When I see the descriptions online, I see, say, a cross-section of thoracolumbar fascia, and they really struggle to put a word here on this line and here on this line, and the images don't acknowledge the tissues that are continuous. The images don't acknowledge the tissues that are fused together and can't be separated with a knife, so that functionally they are the same thing. And so all I can say is smart people will always disagree about complicated things.
Excelente, professor.
This is excellent, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. We have more questions here, and folks, please remember to ask questions through the Q&A feature. That's really important because in the chat, we're chatting around. Fabiana, can I ask you a question? Sure, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It was amazing. Thank you very much. Eu quero te perguntar.
Let me ask you a question, Professor Gil. I have a question regarding the perifascia.
My favorite.
when you dissect it, do you see differences between different people in the quality of the perifascia? Because the perifascia is in different parts of the body. But I'm wondering if we can see a different trait or a different quality to these tissues. Can you hear the translation, Professor? You can, right?
Yeah.
Great. He's just checking his sound. That's his question.
Yeah, thank you. So I see differences, but I cannot yet tell what is the root of the differences, because I'm working with the dead, and I'm working with tissues that have different states of quality. So sometimes the tissue is embalmed. Oftentimes I work with unfixed tissues, so they're not preserved. And still, I see great similarity once you understand what you're working with. So from area to area of the body, sometimes I'll see perifascia that's maybe more thick, maybe is transitioning. So when I look at the fascia, for instance, over the serratus anterior, and I look at it, and sometimes it appears like it's perifascia that's on its way into dense fascia. It's somewhere in between. Now, I can ask myself with you, is this a function of the person? Is this a function of the tissue condition? Is this a function of universal anatomy? And because there's so much of it, and there's so much to observe, I can't yet tell in the specimens that I work with what exactly was the condition of the tissue when they were alive. So the way that I make a judgment about the condition of the tissue in the living is by function. Where I see limitations on function, where I see limitations of movement, one question I ask myself is there dehydration in the watery reservoir of perifascia? Is there adhesion between tissues that would normally have differential movement because perifascia is scarred? And now things that had differential movement lack differential movement. So I can't tell so well yet in the dead, but I feel like I can tell more in the living. You see, there's stages of health to the perifascia. The healthiest is when it's slippery and wet and dynamic in its range of motion. Then if you take away maybe how much water, 1%, 2%, 3%, I don't know. But at some point, when you've lost enough percentage of hydration, you're going to change the physiology of the tissue. It doesn't have to be 50%, then you're dead. But if it's 1%, maybe we're having changes in the electrolytic properties of the tissue. We're having changes in the changes in the flow of chemicals and information substances through the perifascia. I don't know how much we have to lose for it to lose function. That's more study to be done, but I'm interested to know. Maybe at some point, the innervation of the perifascia, if it's lost enough fluidity, starts to diminish, cause pain. I don't know. I need Carla Stecco to tell me. I needed geniuses who work in laboratories to tell me what's going on in there. Thank you. Is there another question?
Temos algumas perguntas.
Yes, we have a few other questions in the chat.
Okay, great.
Let me tell everyone that Fabiana has added the URL to the professor's webpage in the chat. So if you're interested in more information, please go. Now, Professor, we have a few more questions.
It's so funny that you call me professor. You're the only people in the world who call me professor. Everyone just calls me Gil. Feel free to call me Gil. I have never had so much honorary title. I have no university. I'm just in my living room.
Desculpa, Gil. Desculpa, vamos lá.
I apologize, Gil. All right, so we have a question from Rose. If someone gains a lot of weight, where is this fat going to usually? Is it going to reach the extraperitoneal fascia, or is it going to stay in more superficial layers? And is fatty tissue flexible?
Yes, Rose. Fatty tissue is very flexible. Fatty tissue is part of our capacity to move well, actually. The superficial fascia sleeve of the body is force conducting. It's conducting wave motion through the body. And how the lipids distribute in the body, how adipocytes proliferate, is very individual. So there are places that fat deposits, but depending on the person, it will be more abundant in one place than in another place. Now, we don't get to choose if it all comes to the chest and the hips. For some people, it's going to come to the thigh. For someone else, to the abdomen. For some people, it will build up on the outside of the abdomen in a superficial layer, and we'll see rolls of fat. But for other people, like my father, he did not get fat on his outer sleeve. He got common. For some people, when they gain weight within the peritoneum, in the mesentery, in the mesocolon, in the transverse mesocolon, in the epiploic appendages of the colon, in the lesser omentum, in the greater omentum. All of these places can be places of fatty deposition, and then some other people will build up their fat around their kidneys and have very large fatty buildup around the kidney. Some people will have fatty buildup in the fascia propria or the extraperitoneal fat, as you saw. So there are very predictable places where fat expands. Fat is very predictable anatomy, but the volume of it is very variable.
Perfeito.
That's perfect. Thank you. Gil, another question.
Yeah.
Andrea Soares asks, when you mention the perifascia, you always emphasize movement between these structures. So her question is, when we have a tougher perifascia or a stiffening of the perifascia, does this affect the quality and fluidity of movement?
I believe so. So here are maybe the stages of condition of perifascia. Stage 1, healthy, slippery. When perifascia is a membrane system that is transitional between textures. So if I have superficial fascia, and then I have anterior rectus sheath, and then here I have perifascia, If it's in good condition, I have movement. Here I have my, let's do another layer. Here's my rectus abdominis, and here's my anterior rectus sheath. Between the inscriptions, I have movement because of the perifascia. Beneath the rectus abdominis, I have posterior rectus sheath, and there's more movement because there are no tendinous inscriptions because of the perifascia. Look at my arm. Skin and superficial fascia shear over the deep fascia via perifascia. So this is why I'm referencing it as movement tissue, always. And if, say, you've been sitting for this talk, you've been sitting on your butt. When you sit on your butt, you push the fluid out. It heats up. It literally heats up. So you push fluid out and it increases the temperature, and you're inflaming your butt because you keep listening to me. And so the tissue quality is going to start to change in real time. When you stand up and you move around, then the tissues recirculate, and this happens through movement, and they very quickly recover their quality, their slippery quality. It's like the river flows again. But if you repeat behavior for years and years, then there's a certain quality to your movement. I'm a grumpy old man. Certain quality of the movement, and that's going to be reflected in the perifascia. Now, so first stage is slippery, second stage maybe is gummy or like more gluey. Now, how gluey, I don't know. Just say a little bit, because it's not being used. It's not being moved. It's not being flushed. But you can go past gummy to the point where crystals start to form in the tissue. And you lose slipperiness. You get adhesions, and even the possibility that those crystals could shatter so that a tendon tears. When you take a step and you fall down and a tendon tears because the tissue is brittle. It's not resilient. It doesn't yield. It doesn't have the same kind of moisture. So it's like slow cooking. If you take good food like onions and you put it with oil in a pan, and you slowly cook the onions, the onion changes. It's chemistry. The onion changes and it starts to smell good, and crystals form and aromatic substances form in onion cooking in oil, and sugars, right, start to come out and combine with the fats and create delicious flavors. We do this every day. But in your body, if you're slow cooking your tissues, if you're slow cooking your perifascia through chronic inflammation, there's good news and there's bad news. So the bad news is those crystals that are forming in your tissues are very hard to get rid of, and you're reducing your movement potential. But the good news is you're going to taste better. So,
Pode pegar.
Bom, Gil, muito obrigado mais uma vez.
Well,
Gostaria
Gil, thank you so much once again. On behalf of all our organizing committee, I would like to thank you so much, and please rest now. 3 hours, very intense. Everybody was so excited to hear you, so this is a well-deserved rest. I would like to thank also all of those that asked questions. Now we'll pause and we will come back at 2 p.m. Brazilian time. At our website, we have a time converter, okay? See you later.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to learn with you.
Gil, mais uma vez,
Gil,
obrigado.
once again, I just want to say thank you. And I would like to remind you all that Fabiana wrote on our chat Gil's webpage, and you have to see it. You must see it. It's a fantastic work. He is such a bright person. Fantastic, really. You cannot miss it. Thank you once again. Have a great day, and we hope to be together very soon.
Thank you. Bye. That was fun. How do I leave? There we go. Thank you. I can't believe it.